Imagine being buried waist-deep in the earth, the crowd silent as the first stones strike. This was Ishikazume, the punishment for adultery in Heian Japan, an era we remember for exquisite poetry and art, not calculated brutality. How could a society that worshipped beauty practice this? The state's own legal codes, imported from China, meticulously detail this and other punishments, known as the Five Pains. But here is the secret the official histories don't tell you. For over 300 years, the elite who wrote these laws never faced them. Why was the death penalty suspended only for the aristocracy? What were they so afraid of? The answer lies not in the law books, but in a hidden medical text that reveals the true, disturbing purpose of sex for the powerful, a purpose that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with life itself. To understand what was really happening, you have to look past the public punishments and into the private rituals they kept secret. What we found will change how you see this golden age forever. Let's return to that pit in the ground. Feel the weight of the packed earth, a cold vice constricting the body from the waist down, pinning it to the spot. The sun beats down. There is no escape. The crime could be adultery, but it could also be rape, theft, or even blasphemy, like killing one of the sacred deer in the capital. The sentence is absolute. The first stone isn't thrown in a fit of rage. It's delivered with a cold, procedural calm. This is not mob justice. It is a ritual, a public spectacle, sometimes performed by religious practitioners in full ceremonial robes. It is a calculated act of state-sanctioned violence. And this is the great, disturbing contradiction of Heian Japan. This is the world that gave us the tale of Genji, a society so obsessed with aesthetic perfection that a court lady's reputation could be ruined by a single mismatched color in the layers of her silk robe. A world where love, loss, and longing were expressed in the most delicate and nuanced poetry imaginable. How can these two realities exist in the same time and place? The diaries of court ladies speak of heartbreak and social anxiety, of the complex rules of romance and etiquette. The official histories speak of the glory of the Fujiwara clan and the flourishing of a uniquely Japanese culture. None of them speak of the person buried in the dirt or the sound of stones hitting flesh. The silence is deafening. It points to a truth that has been deliberately obscured, a world where the law was a weapon, but one that was only ever aimed downwards. To understand how this was possible, we must first understand the architecture of this control, the very blueprint for a perfect, ordered society that Japan imported, piece by piece from the mainland. That pit in the ground, the cold earth, the falling stones, that was not chaos. It was order. To understand how a society could embrace both exquisite art and such brutal punishment, you have to look at the blueprint, the very architecture of control that made it all possible. This story begins not in the golden age of Heian, but a century earlier, in the 700s, when Japan embarked on one of the most ambitious experiments in social engineering in history. The imperial court, then in its new capital at Nara, looked across the sea to the superpower of the age, Tang China. There they saw a vast, unified empire governed by a complex and deeply ordered bureaucratic machine, and they decided to import it, all of it. They called it the Ritsuryo. It was a complete legal and governmental model, a ready-made framework for a perfect centralized state. Imagine unrolling ancient scrolls, the scent of old paper and ink filling the air, as scribes painstakingly copy thousands of characters, translating not just a language, but an entire philosophy of power. The Ritsuryo was divided into two great pillars, the Ritsu, a comprehensive criminal code, and the Ryo, an administrative code that laid out the duties and structures of government. This wasn't just a handful of laws. It was a totalizing vision for society. It established a hierarchy of court ranks, created 8 ministries of state, and defined the administration of every province, district, and neighborhood. It dictated land ownership, taxation, and even ceremonial etiquette. Nothing was left to chance. The codes, like the famous Taiho Code of 701 and its revision, the Euro Code, sought to regulate every facet of human life, from who you could marry to how your family could inherit property. It was an attempt to replace the old, messy world of competing clans with a clockwork state where all power flowed directly from the emperor. But this grand design for a perfect society was not built on ideals alone. It was built on a foundation of fear, enforced by a meticulously detailed penal code that prescribed pain with bureaucratic precision. The law was written on the body through 5 distinct levels of suffering. This grand design for a perfect society, this clockwork state imported from China, was not built on ideals alone. It was built on a foundation of fear, enforced by a meticulously detailed penal code that prescribed pain with bureaucratic precision. This wasn't arbitrary violence. It was an organized, procedural application of suffering. They called it the Gokei, the 5 pains. The law was to be written on the body through 5 distinct levels of torment, each measured and defined. The first was caning, bachi, 10, 20, 30, 40 or 50 strikes on the buttocks, the number dictated by the severity of the crime. Then came public caning, jo, 60 to 100 strikes, performed in the open with a slightly thicker cane, a spectacle of humiliation and pain. If you survived that. The third pain was imprisonment, zu, with forced labor for terms of 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, or 3 years. The fourth was exile, ru, a social death sentence, banished to a nearby, semi-distant or distant province, torn from your family and community forever. And finally, the fifth pain, death itself shy. Even here, there was a cold calculus. Depending on the gravity of your offense, you would face either the rope or the blade, death by hanging or by decapitation. This was the brutal engine that powered the Ritsuryo state. But the law, while written for all, was not applied to all equally. It was written on the body, yes, but for women it was written differently. While the codes from this specific period are not fully preserved, the legal philosophy that echoed for centuries in Japan treated a man's affair as a private matter, a personal failing. But a woman's infidelity was something else entirely. It was a crime against the patriarchal order, a violation of her husband's property and his lineage. These brutal laws, this entire architecture of control, existed on paper, a terrifying blueprint for a society held in check by the threat of measured violence. But as the 8th century ended and the capital moved from Nara to a new city, Heian, something strange began to happen. A new world emerged, a world of unparalleled aestheticism ruled by a powerful new clan. And behind the silk screens of this glittering new court, an entirely different set of rules was about to come into play. These brutal laws, this entire architecture of control, existed on paper, a terrifying blueprint for a society held in check by the threat of measured violence. But as the 8th century ended, in the year 794, the court abandoned the old capital and moved to a new city, a place that would be named Heian, the capital of peace and tranquility. Here, over the next 400 years, something strange began to happen. The rigid, Chinese-inspired legal framework began to dissolve, not by being repealed, but by being ignored. A new world emerged, a world of unparalleled aestheticism, ruled not by the emperor, but by the powerful Fujiwara clan. For centuries, the Fujiwara perfected a unique method of control. They married their daughters into the royal family, ensuring that future emperors would have Fujiwara mothers and Fujiwara grandfathers acting as their regents. With political power secured, the court turned inward, creating a closed, rarefied society obsessed with beauty. This was a world lived behind screens. Women of the aristocracy were confined to their residences, their faces hidden from all but their closest male relatives. They peered out from behind bamboo blinds or sudare, their presence indicated only by the scent of their personal incense or the sight of a sleeve, exquisitely arranged with layers of colored silk dangling from the window of a carriage. In this world, beauty was currency. A man's career could rise or fall not on his administrative skill, but on his ability to compose a sensitive poem, or even on the elegance of his handwriting. Taste was everything. The author Murasaki Shikibu, in her diary, records with astonishment an incident at court where a lady-in-waiting made a little fault in the color combination at the wrist opening of her multi-layered robe. The nobles and high officials all noticed. The lady was shamed, not for breaking a law, but for a single color that was a little too pale. The brutal laws of the state, the 5 pains, still existed on paper. But for this tiny privileged elite, they had become irrelevant. Behind the silk screens of the court, an entirely different set of rules was in play. An unwritten code where love was not a private emotion, but a political act. So what was this unwritten code that governed life behind the screens? It began with the complete redefinition of marriage. In the rarefied world of the Heian court, marriage wasn't about love, it was about power. It was a cold, political transaction, arranged for economic and practical advantage. Husbands and wives of the nobility often lived in separate establishments, a custom known as duolocal residence. A relationship didn't end with a legal proceeding. It ended with silence. The stoppage of visits, when a husband's carriage simply stopped arriving at his wife's gate, was the only signal that the marriage was over. We have a raw, personal testimony of the psychological toll this took, thanks to the diaries of the court ladies themselves. One of the most famous is the Kagero Nikki, or the Gossamer Years, written by a woman known only as the mother of Michitsuna. She documents her agonizing 2-decade marriage to the powerful Fujiwara no Kanai. We feel her inner anguish as Kanai's visits become less frequent, her heartbreak when she discovers a note he wrote to another woman, her humiliation when she has him followed and confirms her suspicions. She writes of her desire to become a nun, to escape the constant anxiety, but she is trapped by the concern for her son's future. Her diary is an anti-romance, a devastatingly honest portrait of what life was really like. For a well-placed lady. In this world, the official laws against adultery were meaningless. For the aristocracy, affairs were not a crime. They were a social necessity. In a society where men and women were physically segregated, extramarital relationships were the primary way they interacted, built alliances, and forged reputations. A well-managed affair could advance a man's career and a woman's social standing. But while the court ladies wrote of romance and heartbreak in their diaries, the court physicians were consulting a different kind of text, a secret text, one that stripped away all the poetry and aesthetics and revealed a clinical, almost mechanical view of sex. And its purpose was deeply disturbing. In this world of political marriages and socially necessary affairs, the court ladies documented their lives in diaries filled with poetry and heartbreak. But while they wrote of romance, the men of the court, the physicians and the powerful, consulted a different kind of text, a secret text. Imagine a hand in the year 984, carefully unrolling a scroll not of love poems, but of something far more guarded. This was the life's work of Tamba Yasuyori, a court physician who had spent years compiling all the medical knowledge of the age into a single, monumental encyclopedia. He called it the Ishinpō, the Essentials of Medical Treatment. Comprising 30 volumes, it is the oldest surviving medical text in Japan, a designated national treasure. It was a breathtaking achievement, a vast library of knowledge drawn from over 200 different Chinese medical classics. Many of those original Chinese texts have since vanished, lost to time, their wisdom surviving only because Tamba Yasuyori copied them into his great work. But this was not a book for public consumption. This was medico-ritual knowledge, a source of immense power that was jealously guarded for centuries by the clans who held it, rarely copied, and shared with almost no one. It covered everything from acupuncture to pharmacology, pediatrics to surgery. But hidden deep within its 30 scrolls is one that stands apart. Volume 28. Its official title is Bunai Hen, a polite euphemism that translates to "on the chamber intern," a delicate reference to the women of the inner quarters. This entire volume is dedicated to sex, but this isn't about love. It isn't about the emotional complexities that fill the diaries of women like the mother of Michitsuna. This is a clinical, almost mechanical manual, a transcription of ancient Taoist sexual yoga classics. It is a cold, procedural guide to the physical act. And its purpose, the reason this knowledge was so coveted and so closely guarded, is deeply disturbing. It describes a set of specific techniques, a kind of sexual alchemy, designed not for mutual pleasure or procreation, but for a singular, shocking goal. That secret text, the Ishinpō, described a set of specific techniques, a kind of sexual alchemy, designed not for mutual pleasure or procreation, but for a singular, shocking goal. Volume 28 is a procedural guide, a manual for the mechanics of longevity. It instructs a man on how to clinically observe a woman's arousal through a series of diagnostic checklists, the 5 signs, the 5 desires, and the 10 movements. The text, a dialogue between a goddess and the mythical Yellow Emperor, is chillingly specific. "How may one know that the woman is pleased?" the Emperor asks. The goddess replies with the 5 signs. Her face flushes, slowly draw near, her breasts become firm, and her nose perspires. Slowly insert. She swallows dryly. Slowly shake. The yin becomes slippery. Slowly push in deeper. The love juice overflows to her hips. Slowly pull. It seems attentive, almost modern in its focus on female response. But the goal wasn't her pleasure. The goal was for the man to absorb her female essence during orgasm, a vital energy believed to grant him health and long life. This was a one-sided transfer. Her body was a tool for his immortality. The texts are clear that the benefits flow from woman to man, not mutually. The entire purpose of carefully observing her arousal was to maximize the energy he could draw from her. In stark contrast, the man was instructed to treat his own essence as a scarce and precious resource, to avoid emission and ejaculation at all costs. As one text puts it, the Taoist considers essence as a treasure. If spent, it engenders others. If retained, it engenders oneself. Her orgasm was a resource to be harvested. His was a vital fluid to be contained. This was the secret sexual practice of the Heian elite. While the official laws on the books prescribed brutal punishments for the adultery of commoners, the men at the top of society were consulting a private manual that treated a woman's body as a medicinal instrument for their own selfish preservation. This creates a horrifying contradiction. How could the same ruling class that wrote laws punishing sexual transgressions with death by stoning be practicing this kind of ritualized, life-stealing sex in private? What happened when these powerful men, so obsessed with their own longevity, actually broke the laws they wrote for everyone else? For over 300 years, the answer was nothing. This was the secret sexual practice of the Heian elite. While the official laws on the books prescribed brutal punishments for the adultery of commoners, the men at the top of society were consulting a private manual that treated a woman's body as a medicinal instrument for their own selfish preservation. This creates a horrifying contradiction. How could the same ruling class that wrote laws punishing sexual transgressions with death by stoning be practicing this kind of ritualized, life-stealing sex in private? What happened when these powerful men, so obsessed with their own longevity, actually broke the laws they wrote for everyone else? For over 300 years, the answer was nothing. From the early 9th century until the middle of the 12th, something strange happened. The death penalty was effectively suspended for the aristocracy. It was a remarkable centuries-long period of de facto abolition, but only for the powerful. The mechanism was simple. Every death sentence had to be approved by the emperor, and it became an unbreakable custom that he would commute the sentence to deportation, exiling the criminal to a remote place. So a nobleman who committed a capital crime would not face the executioner's blade. He would be led onto a carriage and sent away, stripped of his rank, but not his life. For years, historians believed this was due to the peacefulness of the era or the influence of Buddhism. But the truth is far stranger. The real reason was a paralyzing fear of something called kagare, defilement. As the Heian period progressed, the emperor was increasingly seen not as a secular ruler, but as a sacred high priest, a divine vessel whose purity had to be protected at all costs. An execution sanctioned by the emperor, the shedding of blood in his name, was seen as an act of profound spiritual pollution that would defile the court, the palace, and the entire capital. The death of a nobleman was a source of contamination they simply could not risk. So they created a different kind of justice for themselves, a legal fiction where the ultimate punishment was simply to be sent away. But what about the common people? For those living and dying far from the sacred capital? For those whose deaths would not pollute the emperor's holy presence, the law remained brutally real. For them, the old punishments were still enforced, the stones still fell. It was a world of two laws, one written on paper for all, and another practiced in secret for the few. The texts tell this story of legal hypocrisy. But what about the physical evidence? What do the bodies of these men, the ones who lived and died by this separate set of rules, actually remember? It was a world of two laws, one written on paper for all, and another practiced in secret for the few. The texts tell this story of legal hypocrisy, but what about the physical evidence? What do the bodies of these men, the ones who lived and died by this separate set of rules, actually remember? In archaeology, there is a saying, bones talk. They tell a story that can't be erased by poetry or propaganda. And in the mid-20th century, the bones of the Heian elite were finally made to speak. In 1950, a team of scientists was granted rare access to the mummified remains of the Oshu Fujiwara lords, the northern branch of that powerful clan, interred in the Golden Hall of Chusanji Temple. For the first time, modern forensic science could peel back the layers of myth and look at the physical truth of these men's lives. The X-rays and examinations revealed a story written in their very skeletons, a permanent, measurable mark of their elite existence. On the back of their skulls, at the inion, scientists found slight protrusions, bone spurs consistent with enthesitis, the result of excessive, repeated strain on the neck muscles. This was the physical signature of a life spent under the weight of a heavy helmet, or perhaps the strain of maintaining the rigid formal postures demanded by courtly manners. Their shoulder blades told a similar story, showing large enthesial protrusions where the muscles attached. This indicates that the muscles of their upper body, the teres major, the serratus anterior, were incredibly well developed, the clear result of a life spent practicing archery. These were not just delicate aesthetes composing poetry. They were warriors, their bodies shaped by the discipline of the bow and the weight of armor. The analysis also confirmed what their status implied. They were well-fed, showing no signs of the ascetic practices or malnutrition that might be expected from devout Buddhists. Their lives of privilege were etched into their very anatomy. The bones of the powerful tell a clear story. But these men represented a tiny fraction of 1% of the population. For the other 99%, there are no golden halls, no mummified remains, no diaries or poems. So what story do their bones tell? What does the earth remember of them? The bones of the powerful tell a clear story. Their lives of privilege were etched into their very anatomy, but these men represented a tiny fraction of 1% of the population. For the other 99%, there are no golden halls, no mummified remains, no diaries or poems. So what story do their bones tell? What does the earth remember of them? For them, There is only the earth, and archaeology reveals their world. Most people in Heian Japan were subsistence farmers, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the fields. They lived not in elegant pavilions, but in isolated homesteads or small hamlets, in houses that were little more than pits dug into the ground. These pit dwellings were cramped, drafty, and prone to fire, with bedding made of nothing more than straw or dried leaves. Their clothing was made of rough hemp or ramie. Their life was one of relentless, back-breaking labor. But the greatest hardship was hunger. While the nobles in the capital were almost totally isolated from famine, for the peasants it was a constant, so terrifying reality. Based on environmental data and historical records, we know that brutal spring famines swept through rural communities on average every 3 years. In 790, provincial records from just one region, Kyushu, state that 80,000 people were starving. Even the capital, outside the carefully managed walls of the palace, was described as an unhygienic cesspool, where during the frequent epidemics and famines the streets were filled with the bodies of people who had died of hunger. And this constant cycle of starvation and disease left its most shocking mark on the most vulnerable. Forensic analysis of household registers and skeletal remains from the period reveals the most shocking measurement of all. It's estimated that over half of all people, between 55 and 62%, died before the age of 5. For those who survived childhood, life expectancy was barely 40. This is the world outside the walls, the world that paid for the poetry and the silk robes. A world of immense unrecorded suffering that existed just beyond the palace gates, a foundation of hardship upon which the entire Golden Age was built. This is the fundamental hidden truth of the Heian period. Two Japans existing side by side, separated by a wall of power and privilege so absolute they might as well have been on different planets. One, a tiny elite obsessed with aesthetic perfection. The other, a vast majority living and dying in brutal hardship. Picture it. Inside the palace, a court lady agonizes over a single mismatched color in the layers of her silk robe, a minor fault that could bring her social ruin. Outside, in a muddy field, a peasant woman in rough hemp digs for roots, her survival dependent not on the right shade of silk, but on finding enough food to last another day. In a quiet pavilion, a nobleman composes a delicate poem about the fleeting beauty of a single moonbeam on the dew, his career hinging on the elegance of his calligraphy. In the streets of the very same capital, outside the carefully managed walls of the palace, the bodies of the starved are left to rot, victims of the famine that sweeps through every 3 years. Inside the court, a lavish banquet is held, a symphony of rare flavors and exquisite presentation. The forensic evidence of the elite shows they were well fed, their bones strong. The bones of the common people tell a different story, a story of malnutrition, of lives cut short, with over half of all children dying before the age of 5. This is the great contradiction. The entire Golden Age, with all its celebrated art and literature, the tale of Genji, the diaries, the poetry, was a luxury. It was an indulgence built upon a foundation of immense, unrecorded suffering. The glittering world of the court, with its refined sensibilities and complex romantic games, was only possible because it was completely insulated from the grim reality of life for everyone else. The beauty was paid for with brutality. The poetry was paid for with pain. The tranquility of the capital was paid for with the silent, unrecorded deaths of millions. This wasn't just an unfortunate disparity. It was the very engine of the society. The two worlds were not separate. One fed the other. The beauty was paid for with brutality. The poetry was paid for with pain. The tranquility of the capital was paid for with the silent, unrecorded deaths of millions. This wasn't just an unfortunate disparity. It was the very engine of the society. The two worlds were not separate. One fed the other. And that brings us to the final haunting truth. The strange sexual laws were never really about sex. They were about power, the power to write the law, a meticulous code of measured pain and public suffering designed to control the masses. The power to ignore it, to create a separate reality for oneself, a world of aesthetic perfection where the death penalty was suspended for centuries out of a fear of spiritual pollution. And finally, the most absolute power of all, the power to live in a world completely insulated from the consequences of that hypocrisy. As you walk through the streets of modern Kyoto, past the ancient temples and quiet gardens, you are walking through the ghost of Heian. The official histories, written on delicate scrolls, remember the poetry and the political maneuvering. The diaries of the court ladies remember the romance, the heartbreak, and the anxiety of a life lived by unwritten rules. But the bones, the physical evidence left in the earth, remember the truth. They remember the well-fed bodies of the elite, shaped by archery and armor, and they remember the millions who died in childhood, their lives unrecorded and unmourned. The story that began with a person buried waist-deep in the earth ends where it started, with that stark image of calculated violence. It leaves us with a question that echoes far beyond the golden age of Japan. What does it say about human nature when our greatest moments of cultural achievement, the art and literature we celebrate as the pinnacle of civilization, are only made possible by a world of suffering we choose not to see?